السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد. So, inshallah, today we are continuing with a topic, almost like a series that's very similar, addressing a different topic associated with things that generally would affect and touch the Muslims, the Muslim family, the Muslim youth. And so today I wanted to talk about the influence of culture, right? There's an interesting phrase, and I heard the first time I heard it from one of my friends, Sheikh Muhammad Shinawi, if I'm not mistaken. It is Sheikh Muhammad Shinawi. And he said, culture is king, right? Culture is king. And it is true to some extent, because culture, we can't escape it. It has an influence on us. And it does tend to shape us. But to what extent? And what level, what complexity? Is that something that is good? Is that something that is bad? Where does Islam stand from this? Does it accept the cultural diversity, or did it came to replace it? All these things, inshallah, we're going to be talking about today. But one thing I wanted to start with is a couple of verses in the Quran that would help shape our framework, right? And that first verse is from Surah Ar-Rum, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِلْعَالِمِينَ. And the second ayah is يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَىٰ وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِندَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. And this is Surah Al-Hujurat. So the first... Are you okay, Sheikh? طيب. It's kind of difficult to stick this thing into my mouth. Can you guys hear me if I just talk this way? So don't sit at the back, come in the front. Save me the hardship, Sheikh. Right. La, you need to come closer. Wallahi, bring a chair, Sheikh. I don't mind. Bring a chair anytime. I'll sit with you guys here. No, it doesn't. I tried it before. It doesn't work. So, essentially, right, the meaning of those two verses is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ, and from His signs, right? وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, the creation of the heavens and the earth, وَاخْتِلَافِ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ, and the diversity of your tongues. That means your languages and your skin colors. Right, and obviously skin colors happen because of people being in different regions, right? Sometimes in the same region, but most diverse skin colors appear in when people are from different regions. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِلْعَالِمِينَ, verily there is indeed some signs for the people of knowledge, or for those of knowledge. And the other verse from Surah Al-Hujurat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ, O people, we have created you from a male and a female, and made you into وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ, right? We made you into nations and tribes. لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that you get to know, you may know one another. إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ, indeed, the most noble of you in the eyesight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who is أَتْقَاكُمْ, has most taqwa, is most righteous. إِنَّ اللَّهَ خَبِيرٌ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is knowing and acquainted with what you do. So these verses, essentially, if you look at both of them, they indicate that diversity, naturally speaking, is something that is normal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us with diversity, whether it is being in different tribes or different nations, different languages, different skin tones. All these are diversities that exist, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this world with. And so, that being understood, the following verse, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, تَتَعَارَفُوا, this is an encouragement that as individuals, that nations and people, right, get to tap into each other's culture and individual strengths, and use them to attain noble goals, perhaps, right? That once again, that diversity is normal, and we are to take those cultures and get to know one another, essentially. So, that being said, we keep talking about the word culture, but what is culture? Because in people's mind, culture is something like, they give it examples. So, what are the examples of culture? somebody said food, right? Food, yeah, no, I'm serious. People think of culture, they think food, which is true, right? It's not something that is false, it is true. What else? Well, tradition, like what? Okay. So most people, when they say food and clothing, right? Language is also part of that. So, really, realistically speaking, when people talk of cultures, to understand really the vastness of what we're talking about, it's an umbrella essentially. That word is an umbrella. Then underneath it, right, encompasses the collective social behavior, right? Collective social behavior, institutions, norms found in human societies, which obviously will include collective knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws, customs, capabilities, habits of the individuals as a group. Okay? It includes all of that, so it naturally include food, clothing, way of speaking, behavior. All these things are culture, but it also not just that, but it's also ways of thinking, right? Underlying assumptions and expectations. All that is part of culture. Yes. No. And we'll explain why, right? Because, okay, so I'm going to add one thing, I'm going to address that, right? So that being said, also we have to understand that culture tends to work on different complex levels, okay? So you have the greater culture of the country, okay? The greater culture of the country. And then you have, there is the, for example, in where we live, there's states, then it is the culture of a specific state. So it's very easy if you go to Texas, you realize that they have different norms, different behaviors than the people of New York, for example, right? And then there is the city itself, right? The city level, and then the neighborhood level, and even at the family level. Quite often you'll find two families who are neighbors, which means same country, same city, state, township, neighborhood, and yet within those two different families, there are interesting, like, there are very subtle things that you would notice that are considered family cultural norms, right? How many often do you say, that's not how my parents do it, right? In my household, that's not how it's done, right? We see that a lot, right? We hear, this is the culture of a specific family. Sometimes they even have their own different language to refer to certain things, right? One family would use it one way, the next door family would use it in another way, right? These are more family norms, but I'm just showing this to explain, to realize that the deepness of and complexity of the different levels associated with what is considered, like, cultural aspects, okay? Now, that being said, if you realize this, you realize that culture does have a power over us, okay? Now, I'm gonna get to this aspect. Is culture in this case then a human creation or a divine thing? A human creation, right? And this is why culture will change over time, right? Now, religion, is it a human creation? No. Does it change over time? No. That's why Islam is not a culture. It's different, something else. Islam is a faith, right? It's a belief system. It's a moral system. That is why it's not culture. And I understand the confusion because quite often they say Islamic culture. But that's not true, right? There's Islamic behavior that you'll find consistent between, like, all different cultures. But there's also what people would consider Islamic culture is something pertaining something specific. For example, if you go to Turkey, when they think of Islamic culture, like, or arts culture, they think of calligraphy, right? And it is true, calligraphy is something that is attached to the Muslims, but mainly because we're limited by the type of arts that we indulge in, engage in, and the Ottoman Empire was very popular and famous for this. And so it was labeled as Islamic culture, but it's not necessarily culture as in the sense of, like, that aspect, right? It is accepted, obviously, but it's not something that is considered Islamic. It means that from Islam itself, okay? There's more of a cultural human creation. And so we need to make sure that we don't confuse both of them, okay? Now, the way that culture shapes our thoughts and views and behaviors, you can notice them from the different levels. And I'm going to mention about 4 different things so you can get a glimpse of how much it can actually shape us as individuals. And if you understand that, you'll also understand why, if you have two generations, each one is from a different culture or raised in a different culture, you realize sometimes why there's sometimes a bit of a gap of understanding, right? Like the one that comes from one country as opposed to one that's born here. So let's say people coming from Egypt or Pakistan, born and raised there, their children are born and raised here. Sometimes the kids will be like, or the parents will be like, why are you doing this? And the child will be like, I don't understand the question. Why even asking why, right? There's a disconnect over here, which is not realizing that there is hidden effect of the culture which shapes the way we understand and expectations, right? So for example, I'll give an example, right? Language. Language itself is one of many ways through which culture affects human development. Right? It does affect human development. And we know this from research because research actually done on adults, right? That can speak multiple languages. So languages, they forge how they think and reason, right? And sometimes people that speak two different languages, you'll notice they behave differently based on what language they're speaking. Right? I don't know if you guys watch this carefully, but I find it very interesting when my own kids, when they speak one language, they behave one way as opposed to another language. Yes, their personality might lean towards one a bit more, and that's behavior, and so they react to it a bit more. But language does, cognitively speaking, affect how we behave. However, the words and structure that make up a language not only convey an explicit meaning, like on the surface meaning, but it also has in it a deeper association and connection that implicitly, right, not explicitly, implicitly shapes our thoughts, influence, and behavior, right? What I want to say is that there's a hidden power in language, right? Its ability to subtly convey specific messages that shape our thinking, sense of self, and group affinity. How we say things in specific ways does matter, right? Like one word in one culture can mean an insult in another language, another culture can mean, like, something that is good, like a compliment, right? One word might mean a curse, another one might mean something else, like an object, right? But that is like, the power of that language. The exact same word, right? But said in one culture is one thing, in another culture it is something else, right? Type. Another thing that is that we see in how culture affects us as individuals and how it shapes our mind is expectations, right? There are norms and expectations in every culture, right? And it operates almost like a belief set, right? Or action theories that influence our own efforts in relation to achieving, for example, desired goals, right? And outcomes. In marriages, right? When people walk into marriages, in each culture, there's certain expectations. They don't need to discuss it in the beginning, but also this is why sometimes when there's interracial marriages, sometimes if they don't clear it out in the beginning, a lot of misunderstanding happens, right? This is what I expect in marriage. No, this is not what happens in marriage, right? And there's that discussion that happens, right? Even once again, people who are raised in the same neighborhood but different families, there are neighbors, there are different household expectations. And so this is some aspect of a culture. And in this way, expectations not only set our course, but they also set an internal compass that keeps us moving towards specific goals because it is expected. Like at the age of 18, you're expected to blah, 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 right? At the age of 21, you're expected to have this. At the age of 30, you're expected to be here. At the age of 50, this is when you do this. At the age of 60, this is how you live your life, right? Living in a Western culture in the US, there is expectations of what you are achieving in your life. What does happiness look like? What does, what you should achieve, what you need to attain to be happy, for example, right? How you behave to become normal. Those are expectations to be accepted in a society, right? So those are things, expectations that drive, that culture influences how we think. And I'm saying this because we need to understand, once again, how it influences us, but also our generations that come up, okay? Now, the other thing that where culture has a very strong power and influence on us is what's called modeling, right? Modeling, and it is really a very strong culture shaper. Modeling is culture shaper. because it really operates both on an explicit and implicit level. So explicitly, for example, our actions make our own thinking visible to the people around us, including, for example, our children, right? So our actions make visible our thought process, whether it is to the people around us or, for example, to our children at home, and others learn from it and appropriate. Okay. So, for example, if you go to visit a new culture or a new land they've never, never visited, you'll watch how people behave, and you'll behave like them, right? Am I right or wrong? Have you guys ever experienced this before? Like how they eat something specific, you would look at them, right? Watch them, and you model what they do. You imitate them. Now, also at the implicitly, right? Our actions are constantly on display to our children, to our neighbors, to our coworkers, right? And so this is how in a specific culture we tend to influence one another through our actions, right? We see people's passions, their interests, their care, their authenticity as thinkers, learners, community members, and leaders by their actions. Okay? Football, for example, or soccer, or cricket. Okay? The passion that people see, the desire that they want towards something else. In some cultures, they don't understand, like sports. Really, you guys fight over sports? That makes no sense, right? I don't know a culture like that anyway, but most cultures, they'll fight over sports. But I'm just imagining a culture that has no aspect of that. They'll look at people that have fights over soccer games or football games or basketball games, whatever the case is, and they're looking at this strangely. We don't understand this. Like, why is this happening, right? But it's never questioned in the culture where this happens. It is expected. It's been modeled so many different ways that subliminally it's been ingrained that this is normal, right? This is expected. This is how it is. And so when anything comes different than it, what happens? How do people react? Oh, come on, guys. طيب. Give me an example of something, some normal behavior that you're used to that has nothing to do with Islam. You guys can't think of anything? Even something back home, for example, or here. I don't care. Nothing, really? Any behavior, right, that you find that is very normal, that is based in your culture. Oh, yeah, you're going to get a whooping. I know this because my father would tell me how things are and he would yell at me. So, for example, if you walk in, right, if an elderly walks in to their child and their child is extending their feet, right? Oh, you better sit up and cross your legs, let alone lying down, right? That's a complete, disregard, disrespect, right? So, one can argue, right? Maybe there's Islamic aspect of it, but it's more of a cultural thing, right? Here, right, people that are born and raised here, the kid doesn't even remove their headphones to say, "Hello, Dad," right, or "Hello, Mom," or "Can I help you?" Right, and that is something that is normal. And so you can imagine if a person was raised here, and they have a father who comes back from Allah Alam where and walks in and says, "You better sit up when I walk in." They'll be like, "What?" Right? Or the father walks in and the son all of a sudden walks up and says, "Baba," stands up and sits politely and says, "Baba, how are you doing?" And that guy is not used to that, that behavior. His kid went and got raised somewhere else, and he just looks at him strange, right? So those are our behaviors that become very interesting. But the difference is, if you can imagine if somebody's used to a specific behavior and somebody violates that, what would the reaction be? Like, once again, imagine the father that is used to what's the manners is that you sit up. If he walks in, his child refuses to sit up, right? What would they do? Yeah, pretty much. Something not nice is going to happen, right? Obviously, right? But anyway, that's just an aspect of modeling how it affects. Now, also another aspect that is really powerful from culture is routine, right? Routine. And what I mean by that is one thing is it's a very powerful culture shaper. Routine represents a set of shared practices that constitutes a group of way of doing things. Okay? A group of way of doing things, which you can consider perhaps maybe etiquettes, right? In business deals, like, when they have business deals, they meet in a specific way, sometimes a specific place, over dinner, handshaking happens. It's a specific behavior, right? That is routine, that is shared, that is understood, that this is how we're doing things, okay? In another culture, right, that's not how they do business deals, for example, okay? What is it? I can't remember which one. You spit in your hand and you shake your hand, that's a deal. There's actually a culture like that. I can't remember which one it is. But anyway, but just giving you an example of that. So it's more of like a routine, a culture behavior that they do these things. And so this is actually a way that how culture affects people, right? And it controls them. So what I'm talking about over here, if you look at all these things, you realize that we are children, right? We are children of our own culture. It raises us. It shapes our thought process, what to expect, our behavior, our routine. It is a very powerful source. Now, with that being said, how much room is there for culture in Islam? Sorry? Yeah, that's the right answer, right? Enough that it doesn't violate Islam. So the way to phrase it, Islam did not come to eliminate cultures. It came to improve cultures, right? To filter out what is bad and leave what is good, okay? I'm going to give you several examples, right, from the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. I'm going to give you three exactly, so I can drive that through. So one of the examples have to do with example for food, okay? So the Prophet ﷺ was invited to one of, he was out in one of the Arab Bedouin areas, and they brought to him barbecued dab, right? Barbecued dab. Dab is a type of desert lizard, okay? I know you're shaking your head, right? But so it was presented to him, and Khalid ibn Walid was sitting with the Prophet ﷺ. And so the Prophet ﷺ extended his hand to eat from it because it's presented. Obviously, it was not presented as a lizard. It was kind of like, the meat was barbecued and it's kind of left to him. And so the Prophet extended his hand. And it was told to him that it was a dab, right? And so the Prophet ﷺ pulled his hand back. And so Khalid bin Walid saw this. He said, is it haram, O Messenger of Allah? And so the Prophet ﷺ said, no. ولكنه لا يكون بأرض قومي. So he said, this is not something that is in the lands of my people, and so I can't get myself أعافه, right? I can't get myself to eat something like this. And so Khalid bin Walid, what did he do? He ate, right? So this tells you, right, that there are certain norms that even though, for example, the Prophet ﷺ himself was unable to get himself to eat it, he said clearly it is not haram, right? No matter how one population disgusting they may think it is, but the reality is that this is a cultural food at that point, right? A cultural delicacy, if you may want to say. If you want to greet somebody, you barbecue some sort of desert lizard for them. This is the highest level of greeting and hosting somebody. The Prophet ﷺ let it be, right? And so this is more of a cultural thing that went through. I'm going to tell, so this is something that is permissible, right? I'm going to give you something else that is also permissible that is cultural. The Prophet ﷺ was sitting at the masjid, right? And in front of him, there were people from Al-Habasha. Habasha is Ethiopia. And they were playing in the masjid with their bows and arrows, playing in the masjid. And so Umar ibn Khattab, when he entered, he saw them, and so he started throwing pebbles at them to kind of quiet them down. Because it's a masjid. What are you doing praying around in the masjid with bows and arrows? But the Prophet ﷺ said, Da'hum ya Umar, leave them, right? Leave them be, even though this is a masjid. So obviously at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the Muslims in that area, especially in Medina, did not treat that masjid in a specific way. There was no playing with bows and arrows in the masjid. But the Habasha, they were Muslims, right? This is something that is customary for them. When they came, the Prophet ﷺ let it be, even though it's not something part of their culture. But there's, yes, multiple explanations that some of the scholars would mention and say that this is something that is beneficial. Like, in the end, they were playing with bows and arrows. It's a good form of training, an expression of happiness, perhaps, or gratitude in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. There's different explanations, but nonetheless, this is something the Prophet ﷺ allowed, even though it was obvious that was that not the norm in the Medina of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? Now, the third example I'm going to give is the opposite. It's something that is not permissible, that is cultural but not permissible. And so this is when the Prophet ﷺ, in the early parts of his hijrah, in the first few years, when he came to Medina, the Prophet, like, it was narrated by Anas ibn Malik, he said the Prophet ﷺ, when he came to the Medina, the people of Medina had 2 days where they would celebrate in them, right? They would go on and celebrate, full celebrate, like Eid. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, what are those 2 days? And so they said, these are 2 days we used to have fun in it, we used to play around in them, in the time of Jahiliyyah, in the time of ignorance before Islam. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replaced them for you with 2 days that are better than them, Al-Adha and Al-Fitr. Okay? So over here, we were talking about a culture, they had a religious celebration, right? They're used to it, and so they were celebrating. The Prophet ﷺ said no, right? Now, this is the realm of religious aspects. There are only 2 Eids, right, that result in mass celebration of the people, and that is Yawm al-Fitr and Yawm al-Adha, okay? And so here's a situation where the Prophet ﷺ, said, no, we'll filter this out. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you something better than it. And so if you notice from these examples, once again, Islam did not come to replace or eradicate culture. It didn't, right? It accommodates culture. Rather, it is more, once again, concerned with what is permissible or impermissible, right? So it's looking more at the view of what is permissible in the eyesight of Allah Ta'ala and what is not. And so what is permissible, it would remain. What is not, it'll be filtered out. So it's a filtering station, it's a filtration system, right? So Islam acts more like a filter that keeps cultural norms that are not harmful for humans in this world and the hereafter, right? And removes and eliminates cultural habits that are bad for humans in this world and the hereafter, whether in the short term or the long term, right? Sometimes harms or benefits, they're not necessarily immediate, they're long term. And quite often you will not see, especially when you talk about harmful things, sometimes you will not see harmful things except years later, right? Sometimes 20 years later, after they've been inculcated very much into the society and became a norm. All of a sudden, 20 years, we realize that this is not a good thing. So Islam, essentially, because it's a legislation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He knows what's best for us. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us in this religion what is best for us. Because in the end, the whole purpose, the objective, the uppermost objective or the overall objective of Sharia is to bring what's best for us in this world and the hereafter, whether immediately or in the future. But also protect us and keep away from us things that are negative and detrimental for us in this world and the hereafter, whether immediately or delayed. Okay? These are the things that we call either haram or makruh, and the good stuff we call either mandatory or recommended. Okay? Right. So the default thing is, then, when it comes to cultural norms, the default is permissibility, unless specified. Unless specified, unless completely contradicts Islam. And in fact, there's an interesting legal maxim in fiqh, right? And it comes very handy when it comes to contracts and agreements, where it's called al-'ada muhakkama, right? Al-'ada muhakkama, which means customs, muhakkama, which means is used as a rule. So for example, in certain trades, it is expected culturally that certain things are associated with it. Okay? Like, I'll give you an example. When you buy furniture in certain countries from a store, the expectation is that it will be delivered to your home. That's the expectation. You buy it, it'll be delivered to your home. So they don't need to write another contract agreement with extra money for delivery. In this culture, that's an added expense. So it's not part of the contract. So they have to specify it, right? And so, for example, if somebody from another culture comes here and he pays for the shipment and then he waits for it, doesn't come here, it's like, you guys didn't send it. He says, you didn't pick it up. He said, what are you talking about? I bought it, you're supposed to deliver it. That comes back from that cultural expectation, okay? And so in fiqh, they'll tell you al-'ada muhakkama, which means customs are, like, established, or they're used as a rule. So what Islam really does, once again, is more of regulate cultures, okay? It regulates cultures. So when we talk about the force of culture then on us, what we really are talking about is the negative aspects of culture, okay? So that's what I want to continue talking about over here. I'm not talking about the positive things or things that are permissible. I'm talking about things that are negative, right? How cultural norms, for example, that are negative can affect us in a negative way, right? In our outlook, in our expectations, especially when they contradict Islamic teachings. So the question is, what remedy does Islam offer to deal with these things? So I'm just checking, making sure that I'm doing well in timing. So what does Islam do? Like, how does it regulate? Like, how does it counteract this? So once again, culture, there's always things that are positive, things that are negative. Can we agree on this? Yes? So how does Islam help us, right, and teach us to deal with the negative stuff? And in turn, allow us to deal, for example, if you have children or younger siblings that you're helping them, or even, like, neighbors or friends that are affected negatively by culture, how do you help them overcome the negative aspect? By following the sunnah. That is true, but there's an added thing to it. Repeat that again. Yes.
Our kids here, whatever we do, they're gonna follow the culture. But we have to move him closer to follow the book of Allah and the Sunnah.
How?
By teaching.
Okay. Because you said something else. You said, because you said something else that's a bit different.
I said the culture here will change anybody that born here.
Yes.
Even whatever you're gonna do.
Because we are children of our culture. That is very normal. Yes.
I mean, you try, but it's
No,
not.
there's. So here's the thing, right? We have to be very, very. You know when they say pick your battles? Do you know that? You know that statement, pick your battles? Type. So we have to pick our battles. Which ones do we engage in that are important, and things that are not really important? Because remember, not every aspect of culture is negative or impermissible. Okay? So essentially we only engage in the aspects that are negative, that contradict Islam. And so how do we come about to do that? Okay? Yes. Excellent. One of them is getting education. That is true. And you said something, by the way, but it needs a bit of refinement. So education is key, right? So we need to learn and teach, we need to learn ourselves, and essentially educate ourselves, our families, our children, about the basic tenets of this religion, right? Along with addressing some of the misconceptions that are in the environment that we live in itself, because this is what would help protect them essentially. Now we have to admit, culturally speaking, right, as Muslims, from wherever country we are, a lot of times we are more focused on secular education as opposed to Islamic education. Does anybody disagree? You disagree? You agree, right? Because we always think what? They have to have a good education so that you have a good career, they can have money, they have a happy life. What is wrong with that formula? Now, first of all, who sold that formula? Capitalism, right? The culture that we live with. Essentially, it's a West. It is a exported ideology, right? That you need the secular education to have a good job, to have money, to have a good life. Okay? Yes. So, but the question is, how real is that? Like, how happy people are with that equation? Not too many. There's a reason that the number one prescribed drug in the West is antidepressants. We're talking about first world countries. Like we're talking about their gross national product is like one of the highest in the world. They're first nations. But yet, all that money, all that luxury, all that wealth, they still haven't achieved happiness. Right? Because something is missing. Okay? So essentially, we need to move away from that model and realize that yes, by the way, secular education is important. I'm not denying that, but it is not more important than our Islamic education. They go hand in hand, right? Because without that Islamic education, we don't have a firm rooted understanding of the nature of life and how it's supposed to work, right? We don't become immune from some of the misconceptions that happen. We are unable to resist some of the desires and forces that are around in our own culture.
We can do that to our kids. We came from, we're like the first generation. But our kids and our kids' kids, they're going to do that.
That's an excellent question, right? Excellent question, and I can tell you yes. We don't have to go very far. South Africa, right? The Muslims in South Africa are like, considering that they are immigrants, they are one of the Muslim minorities that are in the best shape. They have no problems, right? We're talking about fourth generations that are coming up that are scholars and memorizing the Quran. Fourth generations, right? But it's because how they established it. Now, I want you to compare that, for example, to people that went to Argentina and Brazil. Like people from Lebanon that migrated, or Syria that migrated to Argentina and Brazil. What happened to their, not fourth generation, their first generation was born there. What happened to them? Right? So there is something that happened. There is a difference, and it has to do with what they did in South Africa compared to what they did in South America. Right? What they did in South Africa is that they realized they need to save their children, and so the first thing they did was not just build masajid. From the beginning, they built Islamic schools with Islamic universities, the education part. And so the culture of the entire neighborhood, it is very normal that the child would go in, memorize 5 juz, would even study books of aqeedah and books of fiqh. That is the norm. Well, we're in the middle. The funny thing is we're in the middle, right? We're in the middle. Alhamdulillah, we're in a lot better shape than South America, but we're still not like South Africa, Muslim South Africa. Over here, we started by building masajid, which is retaining something, and so we need to start now focusing more on the Islamic education. And there is a start of that. Like, alhamdulillah, the number of Islamic schools have increased. Even Islamic universities are starting to increase. Not up to par yet, but inshallah, alhamdulillah, it's increasing. And we cannot deny that there is a bit of a change of a wave in the younger generation now. There was a bit of a dip, right? That happened 20 years ago. There's a dip. But now the newer generation, the children in college, in their mid-20s or early 30s or younger, they're turning more desiring to have more Islamic education, right? Yes, no, definitely. No, definitely. The larger chances are when the kids are young. That's why I said, she said education. Education doesn't start when you're old. It starts when you're young, right? That's when it happens. So educate. But even as adults, we need to educate ourselves, okay? So that's education. Anything else?
The masajid has to be the place, not just a fancy place to come and pray.
طيب, I'm going to rephrase that. You're right. I'm going to combine that with something else that you said, but you missed it. You just said it by passing, right? And that is provide an environment, right? Provide an environment that will provide, like, the Muslims and the young children with a safe support network. And that includes masjid, family friends, Islamic programs, Islamic centers. I'm not talking just masjid, I'm talking about full-fledged Islamic centers, right, with programs for the entire family, right? It's no longer viable to just have a masjid. We need centers. This is why now, when, like, the new masajid that are coming out, they're not just a masjid, they're always a center, because this becomes the heart of the community, right? And it should remain that way, increasing in the activities and support in it, right? And consciously, the family members have to make sure that they bring their children to these centers, and if there are no programs, they themselves volunteer to initiate the programs. It becomes a community-wide responsibility, right? This is one way of doing it. طيب, anything else? Yeah, yeah. That's the whole point of providing that place. Yeah. No, I agree, right? And that's how it is. If the children grow up attached to a masjid, to an Islamic center, right? They love that place, then it becomes like an anchor. No matter how much they kind of move a little bit, they're going to go and come back around to that anchor, right? The good memories would help them later on in the future, but also we have to be careful because the opposite is true. Negative memories will push them away. Yes. Mhm. So that is true, but let me tell you the problem. Kids start thinking that religion is restrictive not because of, although sometimes culture unfortunately implements things that are not part of Islam, that makes things more difficult, okay? But a teenager, for example, who starts thinking that Islam is restrictive, why do they have that thought? What do they see around them? Yes, right? That everybody else is doing something without any sort of restraints, without boundaries. And that is considered the norm and the fun. And so, in their mind, because of the culture they live in, they start feeling that this is the norm, and my religion is preventing me from indulging in this beautiful, like, fun activity, fulfilling my desires, feeling those feelings, right? Engaging in things that are. So this is where, like, if you see how the culture influences that thought process. So this is where we have to essentially realize that we need to teach the youth that Islam is not restrictive, it is protective, right? It's not restrictive. In fact, religion actually frees you from the restraints that are placed on you based on your desires. You're never truly free, right? So it's the opposite. It's not restrictive. It leads you to that, like, it protects you and leads you to that freedom, right? But that thought process in itself is not necessarily because of cultural, although sometimes it does. But naturally, kids who are like who grow here without the proper understanding will feel that religion is restrictive. And I had that conversation with many of the young people, for example, in high school. And I asked them, blanket out, I'm like, do you guys think that Islam is restrictive? Everybody said yes, right? And I asked them why. They said, well, we can't have, like, GFs and BFs, right? We can't, like, go out to certain places and have fun with our friends. We can't, and they start naming certain things, right, that their peers are indulging in. And this tells you right away there's a foundation in their mind that has settled, and they don't know about it, that this is fun, this is freedom, right? Because the culture over here tells you that for you to be happy, you need to indulge in your desire. You are your desire, right? And that is not true, right? And so if we understand the underlying thought process, we'd be able to kind of adjust that and address it. But that comes with education, right? Type. I'm gonna make one thing. I'm gonna mention one thing that would help with the overcoming and allowing us to or our youth and ourselves to make sure that we remedy the negative culture aspect, and that is to learn to put religion before culture. So religion comes first and then culture, right? Religion should be the reference point, not the culture. So in the case of thinking that Islam is restrictive, what is their reference point? Culture. And they're measuring Islam to the culture. That's not how it's supposed to be. It's the other way around. Islam is your reference point, and then you measure everything else to it, right? Culture in the end is man-made, and anything that is man-made is flawed. Anything that is man-made is flawed because it inherently will possess our qualities. Whatever we make will possess our qualities. So as human beings, if we're flawed, then our thought process will always, one way or another, be flawed. It's never perfect. That's why it always has to change. Even the laws that we create, away from Sharia, the laws that we create, we put it in there thinking it's a great idea. 5 years later, we're like, oh, this is a really bad idea. We need to tweak this law, right? Or change it, or add like a clause to it, or a whatever, add something to it to kind of change it, to improve it. That always happens, right? And so if we realize this and then compare it to Islam, Islam functions as more of a universal constant that is non-changing, non-negotiable, because it is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is the orbit that we revolve around, not culture. And if we just change that perspective, things will fall more better in place, right? The least of it is when we start engaging in some cultural norms that are haram, we acknowledge that they're haram, right? We don't blame the religion for it. We don't make it halal, right? We realize, because it is important, because if we realize it's haram, there's at least a chance that we will stop one day. But if we think it's normal, are we going to stop? No. If we think that it's the Islam that's the problem, are we going to stop? No, right? طيب. One important thing that we need to understand, and it might help address the also point I brought up, is that we need not to mix between religion and culture. We have to make very sure and be careful not to mix between religion and culture, right? Because this will result in confusion of what is Islam and what is not. Some people tend to resent Islam because in their culture they have a specific way that has nothing to do with Islam, right? That causes certain hardships in their life. Sometimes it can cause them trauma, right? Or whatever the case is, they tend to resent it, and because they think it's part of Islam, they end up resenting Islam. So we have to be careful to separate between that. And once again, the only way we can do that is by education, right? I can't stress how much important education is. That's one of the roles of that's why the messengers were sent, to educate, right? To teach the Quran, the hikmah, right? The purification of the heart. That is their role, right? And that's this has how we elevate ourselves. طيب. Now, one important thing, because because we're talking about modeling and stuff like that, one way that helps, especially with the young people who are growing up here, but also with our neighborhoods, co-workers, is that we need to make sure that as individuals, we implement Islam completely, at home and outside of home. So in home and outside, because any sort of sign of compromise in our faith is understood as a green light to compromise in other aspects of our religion. Okay? We have to understand this. In Islam, there's no separation between the masjid and the street. There's no separation between home and the street. We can't be one personality at home and another personality outside of home. All right? And it does happen sometimes. Right? In the masjid, we behave one way. When we go outside, it's something else. We forget that Allah, right, is not just in the masjid. Right? His rules apply in the masjid and outside the masjid. We're Muslims in the masjid and outside the masjid. Right? That is something that is important that we have to remember. And especially, right, if we have children at home, that consistency is important. Right? I'll tell you a funny story about how kids kind of deduce this and figure out it's okay to do certain things. So this was a story mentioned by can't remember who, but this is a real life story, right? So this individual kind of always bothered him as an individual why Muslims in certain, for example, in the States they'll behave one way, but back home they'll behave a different way, for example, right? And he was talking about the example of the seatbelt in a car, right? People who are from Egypt will know this, or from people from Pakistan, they understand this whole aspect. So in the West, it is the law, or certain countries, the law, you put the seatbelt, we're very good with it. We put the seatbelts, we yell at the kids, put the seatbelts, all these things, okay? And so this person, he always makes sure his kids in seatbelts, mashallah, they obey, they're good, whatever the case is. Now, the minute he crossed the border, and he was traveling by car, crossed the border into another country, all of a sudden his kids were just bouncing at the back seat, right? And so he thought it's important to teach them a lesson of how, as Muslims, we should follow the law no matter where it is. And so he started scolding them, right? And it got his attention that they're just staring at him, right? Which is usually like a child would argue or to do something, but they're just staring at him. And he said, "What's wrong? Why are you looking at that?" They're like, "Baba, you're not wearing a seatbelt." So where did the problem start? That this person himself is violating his whatever teachings he's trying to teach them, right? So similarly, as Muslims, when we act anywhere, it has to be consistent, because whether we like it or not, especially as a minority, we become messengers of Islam. We become messengers of Islam. People will look at our behavior and say, "This is Islam." And so if we violate our teachings and it's something that is negative, people will say, "Look at Islam," right? But on the other hand, our behavior can be an amazing form of da'wah. There are entire nations that accepted Islam because of Muslim merchants, of how honest they are, and their moral character and behavior and honesty in trade. So it does have an effect. It's not it doesn't, right? It is something that is important. And it can be something as subtle when we do even at home, right? Such as trying to teach our kids not to lie. But all of a sudden, when you get a phone call that you don't want, you tell your kids, tell them I'm not here. So you just told your kid to do what? To lie, right? To lie. And once you do that, that's a green light for them, right? So once again, you teach them compromise in one aspect, they'll compromise in everything else, including negative cultural things. One thing that would also help, right? And I did talk about in terms of network, but this is a bit more specific, right? The first lecture I gave was about the importance of preserving our first line of defense, which is family, right? So here is where family is important. Now we talked about how the family has the strongest impact on the child's upbringing, their worldview to some extent or something like that. So in a family, it is important that they maintain, I'm talking about the immediate family, like the father, the mother, and the children. They need to make sure that they have maintained strong ties and are in constant communication with one another, involved in each other's life, especially when it comes to whether it's siblings or children or even spouses, because this is how we tend to detect misconceptions early on, for example, right? Or views that are incorrect early on, and it helps to kind of talk to them and have that discussion. Now, when we're not involved in each other's lives, would we ever pick that up? Would we ever pick that up? No, right? We have to understand, especially, for example, for the parents that have children at home, you don't see these things manifest until later. So from the ages of 2 or 3, they start acting like sponges. They absorb everything around them, good and bad. They go to public school, they're absorbing it. You won't see the behavior. It would manifest when? In middle school. This is when it comes out. But if early on you're talking to your child and about their life, what happened in school, what did you do, how was your day, what you learned, you will start hearing things from your child, for example. Okay? And this is when you can correct it. Same thing with siblings, right? If you have a good connection with your siblings or your spouse, that discussion back and forth, that is important. That's why it's imperative to make sure there's a lot of family time. That is fundamental. That is important. Even the Prophet ﷺ, the busy person that he was, being a messenger, a military leader, involved in politics, uh, religious leadership, he made sure that he always had time for his family. That is really important, right? And so this is one of the ways that we can overcome the negative things at culture and teach them religion can comes first. That connection helps remove some of those misconceptions. طيب. One important thing that can also be done is we need to build spirituality and awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? In ourselves and our children. Because really that's that is a safeguard. And this comes from a beautiful hadith that the Prophet ﷺ had taught Abdullah ibn Abbas when he was young. He said, Ya ghulam ihfadillah yahfadhk. Right? Oh young person, right? Ya ghulam, which means young boy, or young man. Ya ghulam, which means young boy. Ihfadillah yahfadhk, which means guard, right? And protect the boundaries of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the only way you're going to do it is being aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He will protect you. It comes hand in hand, right? And so installing that spirituality is important. And we see that sometimes when people practice religion more as ceremonial things, right? It doesn't reap its benefit. But when they practice it as actions with iman and spirituality, then it has a greater effect. طيب. When we treat Islamic behavior or acts of worship as just ceremonial things we have to do, just actions, right? So prayer and then you get out, you move. It is void. And in between prayers, there's nothing, right? No mention of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no extra stuff that is being done, no Quran, no nothing. It just becomes ceremonial, things that I have to do physically. A chore you get out of the way, right? This is why we tend to do it very quickly. Type حاضر. Okay, I'm been signaled that the chai is ready. طيب, I'm going to mention one thing. Is that okay? Just one thing, inshallah. One thing we can do, or it's important for us to do, is to teach ourselves and our children that not all things are equal. We can never equate between culture and Islam. They're not the same, okay? And we should never treat them as equal or on the same level. And so when somebody says, well, this is what I'm used to doing, you tell them, well, Islam tells you different, right? Islam tells you different. So this is not like that, right? Falsehood is never equal to the truth, okay? And so if we understand this, then we understand some of the arguments of, for example, they'll say, in this country they allow us to build masajid. Why don't we allow them to build churches in our Muslim countries? Well, this comes from the fallacy that both are equal, right? Allowing people to build something that is true and correct is not like allowing them to build falsehood and shirk. They're not on the same level, right? Remember, Islam came to protect people. That's why it's in place that way. I'm just giving you a simple example of they're not equal, they're not the same, right? Wallahu alam. There's a couple more things that I wanted to talk about, but I don't want to prolong this. If you have any questions, I'll take them. If not, please feel free. There is tea at the back, right? You can have some chai. We got 15 minutes before the prayers. جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. Do you guys have any questions? Huh? جزاكم الله خير. We're good? Yes. So if they're young, right, it's very easy to, involve them in routines, for example, right? From when they're young, when they say nip it when it's a bud, from the beginning, it becomes a lot easier, right? You teach them that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that orders us. He knows what's best for us, right? Um, that is one method, in addition to including other stuff with it, which is connecting them to the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That this is better for you, right? So these are different teachings that you can implement in this. But also one of the strongest thing is to involve them with peers, right? Like friends, have a suit of friends, like family friends, that would behave in the way that you want them to behave in, right? That is really important. Like I'll tell you something, right? Um, Dress code, right? Dress code, for example. It's a lot easier to convince both boys and girls to abide by a specific dress code if their circle of friends have that same dress code, right? And so this is why it's very important for us to make sure that we pick family friends, surround ourselves with them, that they have a mutual understanding and an agreement, and so it's consistent, so the child grows feeling that they are normal, okay? But I'll tell you something also that's important. Sometimes the child is kind of fighting this because they want to feel like other kids. But it's important to teach them that it's okay to be different, right? It's okay to be different. There's nothing wrong with that. Being different means you're unique. Being the same means there's nothing unique about you. There's nothing special anymore, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala picked us to be different than anybody else. It is the highest of standards that we're supposed to be in, right? So those are all like kind of little teachings that you can discuss it with them, right? But once again, creating an environment for them is one of the strongest things to do. Like one of the best ways to do that. Hold on. So that's an excellent question, right? Now, their personality will matter. Their personality will matter. So, for example, there are some children, they don't care, right? They have innate leadership qualities, right? And they will fight for their position. So you don't have to worry about the child, right? But what you could do is to help them a bit further, but also kids that don't have that mindset, is start more, dipping into the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, right? Stories of how, Muslims that are different and they're right. They're the heroes of the story, right? Make them feel that they are the hero, right, of their area. This is like a mindset, right? That I am right and they are wrong. That's really important, right? Teach them we're Muslims, they're not Muslims. The funny thing is sometimes you'll find that they start doing da'wah to their peers. Like they'll start talking to their peers about Islam. You should become a Muslim, whatever the case is. Of course, that's going to freak out the parents, right? But you shouldn't care about that, right? They're children. They're talking about whatever the case is. And so if you empower them, it's about empowering them, right? Making them feel powerful. So if they're the only Muslim at school, make sure that after school they have a group of Muslims that are with them to make them feel not alone, okay? Now, I'll be honest, public school system has its own difficulties and problems, right? This is why I usually advise families that should be the last resort that you have is to send your child to public school. And if you send them to public school, you have to have a whole list of things to counteract that, right? Like you bring them every day to the masjid. You put them into Islamic activities and programs in the school every single day. Weekend school by itself is not sufficient, right? At home, they're watching Islamic stuff. You're reading them Islamic seerah stories. You're reading with them the Quran. You teach them Aqidah. Like you're constantly with them. It will require a lot of effort just to cleanse and counteract what's happening and empower them, right? But anyway, hopefully that answers your question. Zahra. You're entitled to your opinion, Sheikh. So everything starts from home, right? Yes, I'm not disagreeing, right?
Like if you have a kid, it's better take him to the masjid, he sit and read and
So that is why I said you create a network, right? A support network that would include also the masjid. We mentioned that, right? We did not say the masjid is not important.
but I didn't see the masajid doing. The masajid is empty between the salah. It's empty.
طيب, let me just answer that question, Sheikh. We have to be very practical in our expectations. So, if there isn't availability, we have to understand why, right? We could easily bring a person to sit in the masjid to teach, but if only one person comes and the families don't come, then it becomes a burden on the masjid and that person is gone, he doesn't want to do it. If there is lack of help, then it's the job of the families to step up and provide that help, right? It is a mistake just to depend on the masjid. Now, the masjid constitutes of people helping, right? We can't just build a building, hire board members, and say run. No, the people of the community realistically needs to do. And I'm telling you this out of experience. I can run so many programs, but unless I have volunteers, people that really want to make this work, it's not going to happen, right? That includes the masajid. So one family can come, it's not going to be fruitful. 2 families might be better. 10, then that's it. You got a launching pad.
Yeah, but you start with one is gonna, the second one is gonna come. It's not like from the first day you're gonna have.
No, nobody said from the first day. Nobody said first day, Sheikh. Sheikh, nobody said first day, but we have to be realistic. You can't just blame the masjid. That is not practical, right? I'm telling you out of experience. This is for years, like I've been doing this since 2011, right? Heavily involved even before that with the masajid. The reason sometimes it fails because of the lack of community participation and support. Like a program running for years. Masajid don't close for no reason. There's masajid that close. Why are they closing? It's not a lack of fun, but it's just the people, they're distracted. It's unfortunate, right? Some families or Muslims, their opinion is that they better invest their days or weekends in something else. But if everybody has the same concern, right, they will bring their children and demand programs. If there is, it cannot be afforded, all of a sudden you have volunteers running it. And in fact, Al-Falah has experience with that. Like there are many programs that are run by families, right, that they're very successful and initiated an entire weekend school, for example. Right? Sunday school, how did it start? Sheikh Azhar, how did it start the weekend school? How did it start? 3 families decided to do it and it went, right? So once again, it's not necessarily the masjid's fault. Sometimes it is, I'm not denying that, right? But we cannot just blame the masjid on everything. The community members have a role in this. طيب خلاص. جزاكم الله خير. Yes. So I agree with you. I agree with you, but it also depends on the nature of the program, right? So yes, so also parents should be invested in the masjid themselves. They should be, right? That is true, right? That is true. Once again, it's modeling, right? You order your child to do something, but you're not there. You tell them to go to the masjid, but you're not at the masjid, right? That's a bit of an issue. That is correct, right? Wallah alam. طيب. I will be yelled at if you don't go drink tea. Okay? جزاكم الله خير. But I'm still here if you have any questions. جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.